As far as Star Wars channels go, we're pretty critical about almost all of the lore. That's just how we roll. We constantly break down why the Jedi Order was a flawed and problematic organization. We talk about how the Kaminoans are just another attempt by the Dolphins to normalize their appearance on dry land, which is just a thinly veiled attempt to lay groundwork for a future invasion. I mean, think about it. Who gains the most from rising sea levels if not dolphins? Anyway, we've also taken a look at the various political factions within the Star Wars galaxy as well. The Empire and the Sith are easy targets, as is the Republic, but we oftentimes throw shade at the New Republic, the Rebellion, as well for good measure. And that's because I want viewers on this channel to learn a lot more than just Star Wars lore. I believe in this simple idea that it is really important for all of us to continuously train and exercise our critical thinking muscles, and so that when we approach new subjects, we're always coming up with our own opinions about things rather than depending on others to think for us. After all, what is the point of all of this individual freedom we always talk about if we're not spending the time to critically think and come up with independent ideas and thoughts? Anyway, if you develop a habit of thinking critically of everything instead of letting your emotions and bias cloud your judgment, you'll begin to realize that there is very little pure evil and pure good in this world. Most people are just normal individuals reacting to whatever the world throws at them and trying to do their best. Every leader, hero, villain started out their lives as mere mortals and had to stumble along the way through life just like the rest of us to reach their eventual peak fame or infamy. Today's analysis is going to be taking a look at how Star Wars has introduced the concept of rebellion to audiences from 1977 until more recently with shows like the Andor TV series. We'll be breaking down misconceptions about what rebels are and the concept of rebellion itself, and what Star Wars gets right and when it gets wrong. Hint, if you guys have seen my coverage of the Andor TV series recently, you'll know what I think about the future of Star Wars, especially concerning rebels. When Star Wars was originally released, I doubt George Lucas had much of the backstory that we now know completely fleshed out. At its core, the original Star Wars was a story about a young man coming to age and leaving his moisture farm behind to seek adventure in the wider galaxy. It's a relatable and familiar story set in a fantastical science fiction universe. And so actually at that time, the factions, the background information, it was not fleshed out that much because no one knew that Star Wars would turn into this like massive franchise. And so you only had very basic details about the rebels and the Empire. And they themselves were a simplistic representation of the age-old struggle between liberty and authoritarianism. There was a general sense that the rebels could do no wrong. They could enter a battle with a dozen or so tiny starfighters and take out a moon-sized space station because the Force and plot was on their side. The film glossed over the harsh realities of what trying to resist the mighty authoritarian regime actually looked like. It doesn't show the failures and horrors, the terrifying uncertainty, the lack of resources, and constant hiding that these early rebel cells had to deal with on a daily basis. Yet none of this mattered. I mean, clearly Star Wars was a huge financial success immediately because it was such an amazing movie for what it was at the time. I mean, the special effects alone blew people out of the, seats at the theater. And that's because despite what directors and critics always say in their little behind-the-scenes interviews, films are not designed to pursue the truth. Films are actually designed first and foremost to make money. And so entertaining the audience and getting them into the seats is the most important part of this whole industry. And so you have to connect with the audiences, elicit emotions out of them so that they can care about what's going on. It's entertainment.
We are thieves. We get away with loot from the most beautiful or the most scary or the most spectacular places that you can ever find.
Warner gets it. It's all about wowing audiences, finding amazing stories, amazing places, and then bringing back those moments and sharing it with the audience. This is not all that different from the concept of the storyteller who's sitting around the fire back in caveman days. The only problem is that very entertaining films like Star Wars are also highly influential. Geopolitics in the first Star Wars film might be background information here designed to move the plot along, but political identities were getting formed in kids who were watching these movies at a very young age in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up until today. And what were they learning? They were learning that rebellions are fun and glorious, and that all rebel sacrifices made will be noticed and rewarded with medals unless you're a Wookiee. No medal for you! It seems silly when I say it like that, all sarcastically, but this is the standard Hollywood American narrative in the last 50 years. It's always been this way. And that's because we as audiences naturally like a morally just underdog. Most people want to see fairness and balance in the world, so it's easy to root for such an organization. Plus, for all of you Americans out there, our own history started at the end of a successful revolution against a larger, red-wearing oppressive power. Plus, a deeper, more truthful, analytical look at what it means to be a rebel might not be appropriate for a less than 2-hour-long sci-fi adventure action film. That's about fun. That's more something you might find in a 10-hour-long TV show. And if George Lucas did a bit more research on what the Viet Cong were actually like, these were the guys that he based the Ewoks in the Battle of Andor on, he would have found out that the Viet Cong suffered horrendous casualties during the Vietnam War. They lived often in squalid conditions and were known for committing gruesome crimes against South Vietnamese villagers as well. They were as ruthless as the war needed them to be, and this was a very, very ruthless war. The point is, the Viet Cong are not a good role model for young audiences. This is not what you want to base your cuddly little alien animals off of. And so George Lucas kind of sanitized the Ewoks. I guess having them put punji stick traps in the ground to impale stormtroopers doesn't sell that well either. It also doesn't give the rebels that clear distinction of being the good guys. I mean, perhaps audiences back then were just perceived as simpler, and so creators treated them a bit more simply by showing them a very clear distinction between the good guys and the bad guys. Which is why the rebels are portrayed in such a glowing way. I mean, this is really troubling because if you take a look at human history, the majority of revolutions seem to fail and go nowhere. Oftentimes they cause more chaos and more destruction. And if you take a look at more recent revolutions here on Earth, like the individuals who rioted at the Capitol on January 6th, do you think those guys saw themselves as bad people? No, of course not. They saw themselves as rebels fighting against an oppressive and corrupt regime. Or what about the mass BLM protests across the nation? Do you think those guys saw themselves as bad people? Of course not. They saw themselves as rebels fighting against an oppressive police system. But what about all of those Brits who went out there campaigning for Brexit? Did they realize their actions would lead to economic decline and the potential breakup of the United Kingdom? No, of course not. They saw themselves as patriots fighting against an oppressive European Union. In all of these cases, I think the individuals involved did not understand the full complexity of the causes that they were protesting or rebelling against. And it's not exactly their fault because in this day and age, we replace the truth oftentimes with pop culture explanations of the truth, which are easier to consume and digest, but not necessarily all that accurate. We have ideas like rebels good, empire bad, protester good, authority bad. Now, I'm personally fortunate enough to have followed and interviewed and talked to rebels of all different backgrounds and ideologies throughout my life. And while I find these types of people utterly necessary for human society to continue to grow and be balanced and progress into the future, I also have to admit that most of the people who fit this kind of rebel quality that I've met are very complex and perplexing characters that I might not want to hang out on a daily basis with. To begin with, most rebellions have an intellectual leadership, a small group of elites who discuss and dictate what the movement should do and what they should fight for. But the wider body of such a movement are made up of a wide variety of people. Some of them are activists, some of them are completely aware of what the cause is, but a lot of them are just also troubled individuals who are emotionally unbalanced or perhaps too personally invested in a cause to be rational anymore. And that is because when you are rebelling, it is usually out of desperation. It is usually a last resort. It's not something that most people should want in their lives or see as something that they should take lightly. This isn't something that's captured well within the original trilogy. I mean, Luke is forced to leave his home because eventually his aunt and uncle were killed by the Empire, but it never felt like Luke was desperate, and politically motivated against the Empire just seemed like a bored moisture farmer on an adventure of a lifetime. Which again shows us what Lucas was really focused on in that first Star Wars film. He just wanted to make a fun adventure. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just being super nitpicky at this point. But that was in 1977. George Lucas would eventually pretend like he had a strategy all along to create several more films within the Star Wars franchise. Of course, Luke and Leia were supposed to kiss. Of course, I knew they were siblings all along. It's just kind of funny because, you know, that's my weird sense of humor. In the following years, Lucas would create 2 more Star Wars films, fully flesh out the world of Star Wars. And in the years following Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, we would see the growth of the expanded universe, and then finally a return to Star Wars with the prequel series. Whereas the original trilogy would draw a lot of inspiration from either World War II or the United States' own war in Vietnam. The prequels were a narrative about how republics could quickly turn into authoritarian regimes in the name of security. This was a not so subtle comparison to the United States' own war on terror in the early 2000s. Lucas was getting really good at pairing important political narratives with what was happening in the Star Wars galaxy. The Clone Wars TV show would come out, as would books like Darth Plagueis, and both of these entries would really deeply immerse the audience into the political skullduggery within the Galactic Republic, and let me tell you guys, this was a glorious time for Star Wars fans. We'd watch Palpatine and Darth Plagueis act as shadowy figures behind the scenes, manipulating financial institutions, lobbies, political parties to do exactly what they wanted. This was a really high point in my opinion in Star Wars lore. Certainly the story of Star Wars is getting fleshed out in a way that no other fictional franchise could ever replicate. Palpatine would seize control of the banks, set up a Federal Reserve. He would create a military-first economy and get rid of term limits. The political nerd inside of me was completely digging all of the details. It all seemed to make a lot of sense to me. We also got to see the Jedi during their heyday, and immediately the organization seemed to have severe issues. These holy warriors were not as perfect and infallible as Yoda and Obi-Wan were during the trilogy. The mystery and the allure around the Jedi dulled quite a bit because of this. Now, as I saw all of these elements begin to mature and get more detail and description behind them, I also thought to myself, well, when are the Rebels going to get this treatment? Clearly, they're not as simple and vanilla as they were portrayed in the original trilogy, right? And then finally, the show Andor came out, which I immediately fell in love with immediately and proceeded to fangirl over for the next 2 months or so. Now, one of the core reasons why I love Andor and also Rogue One, which came out many years earlier, is its depiction of the Rebellion. The core Rebellion leadership, Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Leia, are still relatively perfect. They seem to have smaller personal flaws that make them feel more human, relatable, but these were likable people, heroes, morally good individuals you want to look up to. But then you also have guys finally like Saw's partisans. This was a group of criminals, thugs, deserters, murderers, other violent individuals who carried out horrific attacks on the Empire that often also caused collateral damage to civilian infrastructure and lives. This is something that Star Wars has been missing for the longest time. This is an uneasy truth, but whenever you would join some kind of rebel movement, revolutionary movement, you are going to encounter some very hardened individuals who look like they know their way around an AK-47. That is just how life works. You also have individuals like Andor, who starts both Rogue One and his own TV show, gunning down unarmed individuals in order to preserve his own freedom. Then we have Luthen Rael, the other main rebel character. He has this amazing speech about how he's thrown his entire future away. Any hope for happiness, love, or family, it was all gone because he had gone down the path of rebellion. Then during the Aldhani heist, 2 members of the raid team are immediately killed, another one is crushed and mortally wounded at the end of the heist, and another is shot by Andor for trying to betray everyone, and the team leader at the end of the heist is sent to kill Andor. It's almost like a Reservoir Dogs style ending. The rebels in Rogue One and Andor are true heroes, and that is because their actions have clear and horrific consequences. Andor does not hide the uneasy truth that in order to do great things, oftentimes we must sacrifice things we don't want to sacrifice and go through immense hardship. And that's because greatness has to be fought for. It is not handed out freely. Andor is not a perfect person. He's running away from his responsibilities and duties. He doesn't even want to be a rebel at first, and he kind of suffers tremendously because of it. After the Aldhani heist, Andor tries to escape with his loot and start a new life, and what happens? He's picked up in a random police sweep on Narkina 5 for completely bogus charges and thrown into a super max labor prison for Death Star components. Andor joins the rebellion ultimately because he has no choice. And this is a profound lesson I hope younger audiences can learn from Star Wars, and that's the fact that rebellions suck and you should never try to pursue one. And that's because if you are rebelling, that means A, your life was so terrible, so in need of change that you're willing to risk your life for that change. And that is not something anyone should take lightly. And then B, rebellion is not an occupation. It's not a profession. It's not a personality trait. It's actually a crisis, something you should never hope for, because when the time comes, rebellion will come and find you whether you like it or not. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, our analysis of what rebellion means in the Star Wars lore. I think things are trending in the right way. I love the more gritty and realistic approach that Andor has taken to showing us what the early Alliance to Restore the Republic was like. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.